Welcome to PWS United, a podcast for the Prader-Willi syndrome community, brought to you by PWSA USA. This podcast gives the latest news in research, advocacy, and family support by bringing together staff, volunteers, PWS treatment specialists, biotech and pharmaceutical representatives, caregivers, family members, and individuals with PWS. Our goal is to share education, awareness, and resources with those living with PWS and their supporters. Join us in our mission to enhance the quality of life and empower those affected by Prader-Willi syndrome. Before there were conferences, support groups, or even a central source of information on Prader-Willi syndrome, there were pioneers. Parents, professionals, and advocates who built the foundation of the PWS community. One connection, one breakthrough, one act of determination at a time. In honor of PWSA USA's 50th anniversary, we're diving into their stories. This is Pioneers in PWS, a special new series we're excited to share only on PWS United. Together, we'll explore where we've been, how far we've come, and the pioneers who made it possible. Hi, everyone. It's Carrie here. I'm so excited to be sharing our very first Pioneers in PWS episode with you all. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Caring for individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome comes with unique challenges, as we all know, ones that often require breaking the mold of traditional caregiving approaches. Food security, behavior management, and structured environments aren't just recommendations. They're necessities for a better quality of life. But decades ago, there were no standardized guidelines, no advisory boards, and no specialized training programs for caregivers supporting individuals with PWS. That all changed in 2008 when a group of dedicated professionals came together to create the PWSA USA Professional Providers Advisory Board, forming a network that would revolutionize residential care. To truly understand the impact of the Professional Providers Advisory Board, let's go back to where it all began. The article titled Pioneers Devoted to Educating and Supporting Residential Care and Education Professionals was originally published as part of the Pioneers in PWS blog series on PWSA's website. It highlights the challenges and milestones to advance residential care for individuals with PWS. Here's what was written. Providing residential care services to children and adults with Prader-Willi syndrome is often very different and challenging for human services professionals. Some of the supports that are often successful for persons with PWS go against what many professionals have learned in school about providing services for the developmentally disabled. Limiting access to food and providing food security is often met with resistance and misunderstanding. Developing behavior support plans for people with challenging behaviors can also be difficult. In 2008, a group of residential care professionals formed the PWSA USA Professional Providers Advisory Board to help educate and support residential providers. Over the years, not only did they help to develop care standards for providers in the U.S., they also worked with the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization to help providers in many other countries around the world. The Professional Providers Advisory Board meets quarterly. They focus their efforts on providing consulting services to residential care providers who support persons with PWS. The number one issue they assist with is the ability to lock food when the question of violating rights arises. They also assist in developing strategies and plans when a resident is exhibiting challenging behaviors. A large part of their time and effort involves planning and coordinating the Professional Providers Day Conference, part of the PWSA USA convention. Caregivers from across the country come together to learn, share, and problem solve. It is a valuable educational experience. In addition, members of this committee have personally authored or contributed several articles, books, and other publications which address the care of persons with PWS in residential care. One of their major contributions has been the compiling and publishing of the book Best Practice Guidelines for Residential Care, a resource being used by caregivers around the world. Another publication, the 2008 Supporting Adults with Prader-Willi Syndrome in Residential Settings and Experts' Recommendations, filled a major gap by furnishing providers, caregivers, and parents of those with PWS with an extensive manual addressing residential care issues. It continues to be used as part of a specialized training program for PWS. The manual includes management strategies, suggestions for all phases of life in the residence, provider-parent relationships, and many more helpful ideas that were all offered by B.J. Goff, EDD. Mary Kay Zaccardi and B.J. Goff also gave contributed chapters to the third and fourth editions of the Management of Prader-Willi Syndrome Handbook. In addition, Mary Kay and B.J. provide consulting services to educators facing challenges in educating students with PWS. The following is a list of past and present members of the Professional Providers Advisory Board: Jackie Mallow, Patrice Carroll, Mary Kay Zaccardi, Jeff Covington, Steve Drago, B.J. Goff, Evan Farrer, David Wyatt, Jeremy Johnson, Kate Beaver, Kim Stevens, Marguerite Repnow, Stacy Ward, Sarah Clemson, and Mark Lister. The success of residents in their homes directly impacts the quality of life they will experience. Thanks to these dedicated professionals on the advisory board, residential care providers and educators have a valuable resource available to them for consultation and ongoing education. And again, that article, Pioneers Devoted to Educating and Supporting Residential Care and Education Professionals, was written in 2021 for our Pioneers in PWS blog series, which we are now again turning into a podcast series as a way to look back on some of these amazing and important milestones that not just happened at PWSA USA, but for the PWS community as a whole. So I'm very excited to welcome two guests to discuss all things residential care, professional provider care, and the growth that they have seen and witnessed since the inception of this advisory board. I'd like to give a big, warm welcome to our CEO, Stacy Ward, and our PWSA Board of Directors member, Jeff Covington, to the podcast. Stacy has been a very dedicated member of the Professional Providers Advisory Board since 2016, and she continues to be actively involved in shaping best practices for residential care in the PWS community. And we're also honored to have Jeff Covington with us today, who was actually a founding member of the Professional Providers Advisory Board in 2008. He also served as co-chair from 2012 to 2014. And as I mentioned, he is currently a PWSA USA board member. Thank you both so much for being here today. Jeff, I want to start with you. If you can give a little bit of background on your contributions and maybe what got you involved in the advisory board.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. I started working with individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome back in 1994. Actually, I worked as a counselor for uh, a, a summer camp in Wilton, New York, that was run by the state of New York. And that was my first experience to individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome. They were there. There was an entire week dedicated to individuals, adults with Prader-Willi syndrome in New York. And so that was sort of my first experience. A couple years later, I had the opportunity to work with a young woman at the Center for Disability Services who had Prader-Willi syndrome in one of our respite programs, and meeting her unique needs in a setting that was intermittent. And then finally, I left the Center for Disability Services, went to Catholic Charities Disability Services, and they specialized in group homes for individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome. And so I learned a great deal about that. I thought the organization did a great job of consulting with experts and bringing people in to assist us, allowing staff who were working with individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome to attend conferences and trainings. And so I started going to those, and we started having more knowledge and expertise, and we started presenting. And then eventually, working with the Prader-Willi Alliance of New York, and then eventually PWSA USA, when they created the Professional Advisory Board, I was asked to be one of the founding members, and it was a wonderful opportunity and a great experience.
That is so wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And because I know Stacy also worked at Catholic Charities, you guys probably have a very rich background together, rich history.
Yes, yes, we do. We learned a lot together. I tried to teach Stacy everything I knew when she came in the door, and then she learned, and she's probably much more of an expert these days than I am. But we learned a lot together, and we grew the organization and our staff and their level of working with people with Prader-Willi syndrome to a higher level. And we were very proud of that.
Absolutely.
We
As
still
you should
are.
be. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yes.
I would say we personally am still proud of the work that we did at Catholic Charities. And really, I credit a lot of my love for people with Prader-Willi syndrome and the work that the association does to Jeff. And the way that he and some of the other coworkers that we had at Catholic Charities really approached people with PWS who at times could have some challenging moments with so much respect and love that I didn't see that in anywhere else that I had ever worked before.
That's some praise there, Jeff.
Yes, very much so.
Don't let
Thank
it go
you.
to your head.
I most certainly won't.
Well, is there anything else, Stacy, that you wanted to share about your background before we get into the conversation here?
Sure. So I actually got involved with the advisory board when Jeff left Catholic Charities. There was an opening, and I had joined as a representative from Catholic Charities and still being a provider right before I also left Catholic Charities and came to PWSA. So there was a short period where I was representing a provider, and then I became the staff liaison to the group all within that year.
Well, we're so lucky to have both of you involved in the advisory board, over the years at different spans of time as we'll get into, and then just continuing to, be major people within the PWS space. So let's get into the conversation here relating back to that Pioneers in PWS article that I just read. So Jeff, I'm going to start with you. As you mentioned, you were a founding member of the advisory board in 2008. Can you share what led to the creation of this group and why it was so necessary at the time?
Most certainly. So, and one of the things is that with the advances in some of in the medical and the health field as well as the residential field, people with Prader-Willi syndrome were living longer and having more fulfilling lives, and so they were looking for a residential placement. And so there were a number of organizations that were providing services to people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and there needed to sort of be a sounding board for them. There needed to be a place, an entity that they could go to for help and support. When they were opening up a group home, we could come in and sort of assist them. I did that a number of times, and that was always sort of fun, working with them and getting that stuff done. So we just had a number of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and there needed to be some consistency around the country about how individuals, with Prader-Willi syndrome were going to be served either in an educational or a residential setting. So at that point, it was really, really important to be able to have that consistency because you were hearing from families that there were sort of, there were places that were, again, they had that commitment to serve people with Prader-Willi syndrome, but they could be doing it better. And so they needed somebody to lead them and talk to them and, be able to point them in the right direction and have some of the really good input about how that those services should be provided.
Absolutely. That sounds like it, was extremely needed and became very beneficial, as we all know. And so going then into, Jeff, as we said, had been there until I think 2014, and then a year break, and then Stacy came on to take his place, as she mentioned. So Stacy, even though you weren't originally, part of the advisory board when it was created, you have still been a member for almost 10 years now, and you know a ton about the history of it and where it's been in the last 10 years. So can you share a little bit about how it's evolved since you joined?
Sure. So as Jeff mentioned in the beginning, it was a lot about being available to providers, especially providers who were coming into the space and wanting to support people with PWS, maybe specialize in care for PWS. What's happened kind of in the last probably 5 to 7 years is you have less of those larger providers stepping up and doing that, and you have a lot more smaller providers who maybe are supporting only one person or two people with PWS. And that changes the dynamic. It changes the type of support that they need from us as an advisory board. There's still the education piece, which is never going to go away. Until you're working with people with PWS consistently, you don't really understand the challenges and the unique ways that you do need to support them. So it's hard for provider agencies who are supporting one person or two people to really understand those unique ways that they have to support somebody. The food security piece tends to be real challenging for those new providers. It's against everything that they know. As a society, we want to encourage people to be more independent, to take risks. And then we come in and say, there's some risks that we don't take or we don't recommend that you take around food security and those types of things. So there's a different learning curve with these newer, less experienced agencies than perhaps we saw with more established agencies that were morphing into PWS services or expanding their PWS services.
Absolutely. Can you give a little overview of who's currently on the advisory board or who has been serving, just where they're from, maybe to give
Sure.
some of that insight?
Yep. So one of the founding members, Patrice Carroll, is still with us from Latham Centers. And Brittany Clement has also joined from Latham. Nicole Tingley, who is from DD Homes in Illinois, is probably the newest member to our group. There's myself, there's Lynn Garrick, who not only is on our staff, is also a director with AME Services in Minnesota. She joined that group probably 5 years ago or so. Kim Tula, who was with Prader-Willi Homes previously, is on that group, as well as Marguerite Rupnow.
That's a great group. And they all come from a lot of them at least come from different groups and group homes that have different experiences and can bring a lot of
Yeah.
knowledge and things that they're seeing and going through and growing through and talking to, care professionals directly every day and can kind of give feedback to this advisory board, which is great.
Yeah, it's a really great group that has remained committed to not just supporting the PWS population, but other providers in the space.
Yeah. My next question here is taking a step back into history a little bit. So, and maybe Jeff and Stacy, you probably have some knowledge on this too, but what would you say was some of the biggest misconceptions about caring for individuals with PWS in a residential setting back then?
I think there was a lot of, particularly in the beginning when you had a new residential program and people would come from the Pittsburgh Institute and come into residential setting. And so there was a lot of misconception around things that you could do inside a community group home versus what you could do inside an inpatient clinic at a hospital. And sort of, making sure that, families understood that yes, while there were going to be some potential restrictions and they were going to have the locked fridges and stuff like that, it wasn't quite as controlled as it could be in a hospital setting. So I think that was sort of one of the misconceptions is sort of Pittsburgh got lumped in with residential. And while there's a residential component about it, it is a completely different environment. And so sort of having to work through, I think some of those things. I think there was I think we learned very, very quickly that the level of involvement potentially that individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome had, the relationships with their families and how involved the families were and how big that relationship was to the individual with Prader-Willi syndrome, we discounted. We were just sort of used to, sometimes people would move into residential settings and their families would just sort of, they would be involved, but it would be, around the holidays or certain things. And I think that relationship the individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome have with their families, I think it's hard for families to let go. I think they, and oftentimes they have been the only person who understood what Prader-Willi syndrome is and where they advocate for their folks, and turning that responsibility over to somebody else is extremely difficult. And so making sure that you had the processes in place to be able to deal with that level of engagement, I think we underestimated at times as providers.
I would agree with that. I would say for me personally, one of the biggest learning curves I had was learning that just because you can control the food security doesn't mean all other symptoms of PWS go away. So there was this misconception for a long time, at least on my part, that if you controlled the food, you'd never have another challenging moment. And that just wasn't the reality. And it's not the reality for anybody.
Right. I think
True.
providers would still say the same thing today.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, on the opposite side, then, how has residential care for individuals with PWS evolved then, kind of since this time?
Oh, wow. There's been a lot of evolvement, I would say. We're seeing a lot more providers downsizing the size of programs. So we're seeing more and more people living in apartments by themselves with some staff versus a 4 or 5 bedroom house. We're also seeing an increase in those natural supports being involved and providing some of that care to close the gaps that you have when there's staffing shortages or lack of other resources to keep people engaged in living the lives that they want to.
I think also like that, supports to individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome doesn't happen in a vacuum. Families and individuals no longer want sort of moderate sized group homes. That's again that, oftentimes the funding's not there. It's also not something that people want, right? They want smaller settings, and we're sort of being able to do that. I also think the biggest outgrowth and the biggest sort of boost to supporting people in residential services, and I think individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome can take advantage of that, is technology. The use of technology and enabling technology in order for people to be safe but also have a level of independence, and using that technology to make those things happen. Stacy and I did it a long time ago. We were one of the first way. We were buying cameras at Radio Shack. I mean, that's how that's how little the technology was at those days, and it worked. And it's only improved, and it's only gotten better, and it's only gotten more secure. So I think that, we need to be able to take advantage of that. And that's sort of, one of the things that's happened in society that have made supporting people with Prader-Willi syndrome more of a reality is the use of technology.
That's a great point, Jeff. And Carrie, if you want to tag the technology page of the website that speaks to the supports Jeff's mentioning, that'd be great. It'll be in the show notes for people to take a look at, but that's a really great point. I forgot, we had been doing it for so long, Jeff, I kind of forgot a little bit that wasn't necessarily the standard for everybody.
It wasn't back then. No, it was very novel. It was risky, but we made it work. We had the right people. Yeah, I mean, and when you take a situation like that, and again, you're willing to take that risk, and there were a number of reasons, we needed to and wanted to do it. We had to do it in a planful way, and you had to have the right cast of characters, and that included the family, the individual, and of course your staff. Not only your direct support staff who bought into it, right? They saw that these people living together was not a good idea, and that it was causing a lot of stress and a lot of drama, and so we needed to get out of it, right? And so that use of technology, so they were seeing the negative impacts of that, and so they were willing to go above and beyond because they could see that what we were doing was going to make life better for people, and that's really important, really, really important. It really enhanced the quality of life for the two individuals.
As Stacy mentioned, we'll definitely have a link to our technologies page in the show notes for people to go check out some of the great ways that they can implement technology. And this is kind of a question just that has come up since we've been talking, and it's maybe just for me to really want to know. But from 2008 to today, has there been a big increase in the amount of group homes and residential care opportunities out there, or is it pretty much the same? Like, what has that shift looked like, if any?
I think there was initially an increase, and there's been a drastic decrease in the last 5 years. And I think some of that comes with funding cuts. It comes with difficulty finding direct care staff who stay. So as Jeff mentioned, having the right group of people is so key to the success of the program and the individuals who live there. I hear, at least from providers pretty regularly, who are closing their PWS programs because they're not receiving reimbursement rates that allow them to pay direct care staff a higher wage to help keep them there, to help provide that training, send them to the conferences, things like that. We see kind of the big people who have been around for a really long time. So Latham, Prader-Willi Homes, AME, Catholic Charities, Rem Ohio, they've been around a long time. And they're really not going anywhere completely. But even those agencies have had to change how they provide the service in order to remain a viable program for people. But we're seeing less and less of that type of setting and more of that individualized apartment with more of a self-direction or non-guaranteed staffing that you would have through a certified site, like a traditional group home.
Yeah, it used to be like if you were a smaller state, for example, and you only maybe had, a few people with Prader-Willi syndrome that were looking for residential services, it didn't make sense for you to open up an 8-person group home. So you sent them to another state that you had a contact with. right? And that's when you started to see some more of the more larger multi-state providers who were taking people from other states, and now there's more of a push to keep that money in state. Services have evolved, so it's like you don't have to have an 8-person group home anymore. You can support somebody living, in an apartment, below their mom and dad, and bring supports into them. So I think there's more people providing the service, and it looks a lot different. And sort of getting those people supported is something really important. And it's a lot of it's about identification. And then once you get identification, then it's sort of that outreach and getting them and bringing them into the fold, and making sure that they have access to your resources and those type of things.
Wow, very interesting. Thank you for the candidness and answering that question. So, a little bit still along those lines, going forward in terms of residential care, I'm sure that the future is always, a question mark, but I'm sure the advisory board is kind of looking at future ways that we can continue to improve residential care for individuals with PWS and help continue to train, our residential care providers and things like that. And honestly, the space might look a little bit different because of potential treatments that might be coming in the future. So, what kind of conversations have you had around that and just like the future of residential care?
That's actually a topic that we had during our residential conference this past August. It is something the providers are wondering, what is it going to look like when we have some approved treatments? Is the type of care, is the level of care going to be the same? Is that need is still going to be there? Are there going to be ways that providers can cut costs by maybe not staffing 1-to-1, 2-to-1, and maybe staffing 1-to-3? We're seeing more of the use of technology for those overnights. I think we're going to see that change, where there's things like cameras and motion alarms, depending on your state regulations, that are going to allow people to be much more creative in how they provide that service, so that then they are using those waiver reimbursements in a way that can hopefully maximize the quality of care then. So the only other thing that I know that we've talked a lot about is really creating a mentor program within the providers. So pairing up newer providers or agencies who have had some changes in their structure, or the folks who are overseeing their PWS programs, and pairing them with somebody who has been around a little bit longer to help them walk through those challenges and maybe be a little bit more creative in how they provide the support.
I also think one of the biggest challenges we have in our field, and consequently to supporting people with Prader-Willi syndrome, is how do we work with folks in a who are aging in place. So how the changes and the improvements that we've seen in medical and healthcare, we sort of have a population that is aging, and so what is that care going to look like in the future? Whether it's the diminishment of cognitive as well as some physical abilities, how are we going to manage that? And what is that, and what is that going to look like? Not only from how do we manage their sort of physical space, the homes that they live in, but the supports that they need, and what is that going to look like, and how is that going to change, and how are we going to meet those needs? We haven't been in a position to have to worry about that, and now we do. And so I think it's a huge thing that we're going to have to try and think about and do some innovative things to meet those needs.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought that up, Jeff. And it's a wonderful thing, at the end of the day, because our individuals with PWS are getting older, they're aging, more than they were, many years ago. But it's how do we address it now with the population getting older?
I think there's definitely the aging piece, which is
Mhm.
really cool. Like,
Yeah.
we're watching people outlive their families for the first time, you know, as a general rule of thumb now, which is really, really cool, but it's so unknown.
Mhm.
So, there's a lot of talk, not just in the provider space, but also in the parent space of older adults about, is this normal? Or is this PWS, with all of these different things that we're seeing now? So, in the general population, we know if an elderly person has a UTI, their presentation is going to be impaired. Very often there's an impaired mental state. And we're starting to see, is that different for people with PWS? Or is dementia and Alzheimer's a higher risk? We don't know. we don't know any of these things yet. So there's a huge learning curve for all of us right now.
Yeah, I think like you said, it's just kind of addressing what those questions are right now and
Hmm.
kind of getting to them as more data and details come out as time
Yes.
goes on. So great discussion. And I wanted to move on now to the best practice guidelines for residential care publication, which I know that Jeff was an author on, and it
Yep.
has really become an essential resource for providers around literally the entire world. So I'm hoping that you can talk to us today about the process of developing that publication and then why it remains so important today.
Absolutely. It was probably one of the most intense and most rewarding experiences I've ever had. It was, we were in Germany for several days, working together. It was very intense. We were working really 14-hour days. And so sort of what we were doing was we had a group of us that were leaders. I was one of the folks that was like a leader of one of the chapters, if you will, right? And so we would go and we would meet with a group and we would have different presentations and we would sort of take notes. And then sort of most of the group at that point would sort of be done for the day. Those of us that were leaders would sort of get together and try and get, piece together, some information that could be a little bit more coherent, start to take the look of what a chapter of a book might look like, right? And it was absolutely wonderful. We had people from many, many different countries, many, many different cultures, many, many different, it was residential and education and things like that. And so really putting all of that sort of information together and coming up with what we thought were the sort of those best practices. Again, it was sort of worldwide. It was from a different group of, a lot of different perspectives and really just giants in the field internationally. And there were just folks, whether they be here in the United States or there's some folks from Europe and all over the world that were just doing some really interesting things. And they had a lot to offer. And so we were able to come up with those guidelines. I hope, and I like to think they're still relevant today. A lot of that is sort of the cornerstone and the basis of how you deal with people and how you, and particularly in a residential setting, individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome. And I think we really got to the heart of it. And then sort of after that is, after we all left Germany, then the group leaders sort of went back, and that's when we started really piecing it together and coming up with the various chapters sort of based on what we learned there. So it was a lot of work, but it was also extremely rewarding, extremely educational, and just an overall wonderful experience to be involved in.
That does sound like a toll, Jeff. But I'm so appreciative to you and everyone else who contributed in writing it. Because like you said, it's just critical, very helpful tool for, residential care providers from then to now. Yeah, thank you for having a hand in that. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was like I said, it was an extremely it was extremely complimentary to be asked to do that. And I was extremely grateful for the opportunity. And while it was a lot of work, like I said, it's probably one of the most rewarding things I've done professionally.
That's awesome. And so, Stacy, I'm sure that's not the only thing, that the advisory board has helped to contribute to as far as publications and articles and resources. Is there some others that you can speak to, or some that
Sure.
you're working on, or
So
whatever you want to
there's
share?
that. Sure. There's that one, which I was not involved in the creation of that, but one of the things that I loved most about that was the international perspective.
Mhm.
That it's just different. Here in the States, there seems to be a lot more regulations around how we provide care. So seeing through this manual ways that you can do that creatively using natural resources was really cool. It was one of my favorite resources as a provider to use.
That's
There's
awesome.
been so many that the group has created over time. BJ Goff authored it's a residential settings manual,
Mhm.
essentially, where, it had some of my favorite stories. You learn a lot about providing care for somebody with PWS through storytelling, and in her manual, she did a lot of that, which really, I think, for direct care staff specifically, was useful. Some of the scenarios that were shared were things that you could have experienced any day in any one of the group homes in 2012. it was very relatable for staff, which was a really cool resource. There's been lots of articles. They used to contribute pretty regularly to the Gathered View when that was our means of a newsletter publication. It may have been during Direct Support Professional Week of last year, the group came on and talked about the role of direct support professionals. And one of the things that group is actively doing right now is working with the advocacy group to really push for legislation that will, one, professionalize the role of a direct support professional. So we refer to them as professionals and pay them not as professionals. So really trying to make that match up a little bit more, giving people better pay, and then you can perhaps put some credentialing around that role. So, one of the things that we're hoping to take on in the next year is creating a PWS specific course with the National Association of Direct Support Professionals and credentializing that a little bit. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work that's doing that isn't necessarily as public. I think previously, when providers were looking for more of the hard copy of things, when perhaps the internet wasn't in the stage that it is now, where you can find everything online, people were looking for hard copies, physical manuals, DVDs, flash drives. What we're finding now from a lot of providers is they want a video, or they want you to
Yep.
show up and do it. So we're having to pivot in how we provide that information and education now.
I also think, and going back to the manual that we did, one of the things as we started meeting was that you realized that no matter where somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome lived, many of the challenges they faced were the same.
Yes.
Right? There was always, I mean, they're always gonna have the hyperphagia. There's always going to be people who don't understand. There's always gonna be schools that don't listen to the parents. There's always gonna be doctors who don't. So all these themes started emerging where it they were across, they're not only across the United States, but across the world, right? And so you saw all of those issues. And so that's what's really helped that manual come together, right? Because we were able to identify things that were synonymous across the different countries and the different cultures. And it was really truly about individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome, not about individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome in the United States or Germany. And that's what makes that's why that manual tests the test of time. Because there were just so many things that were the same no matter where you lived or where you were.
It's a great
And
point, Jeff. I think from a provider perspective, I remember, thinking other people get it. I hear parents say this all the time. Talking to other parents who have a child with PWS is the first time that they feel like they've been heard. But by having that group together and talking in Germany and then afterwards, you realized as providers you weren't alone either.
yeah. And I also and I'm going back to one of the things that Stacy touched on about training is it does need to be asynchronous, and it does need to be of a high quality, and it does need to be consistent. One of the things that's great about doing asynchronous training videos is everybody's getting the same message, right? And so they can watch those trainings, they can see those training on their own time. Look, I remember Stacy when we got that fancy video equipment at the Office of Catholic Charities. And I would go into the office at 2 o'clock in the morning and do video training for all of the overnight employees, right? And we thought
Mhm.
we were a big deal. But now, again, if anybody wants to learn something, what do? They watch a YouTube video, right? And
Right.
so we need to be the same. That's how people today want to learn. That's what other people are doing. And if we want to stay ahead of the curve from a technology perspective, from a cultural perspective, we have to evolve with that and be able to offer these trainings again on demand when people have the ability to do them, not when we have the ability to teach them.
Yeah. And let's not forget, Jeff, we were a big deal.
We were.
You can toot your own horns. It's okay. We welcome it. And to have the content as well as being asynchronous to be dynamic and interesting to look at. So we're going to have one of them coming up soon that we filmed not too
Yes,
long
we
ago. I
are.
can't wait.
Loved having you be a part of that too, Carrie. That was
I
fun.
know. I can't wait. I didn't feel like a big deal, but it's going to be great to have nonetheless. So kind of going along the lines of having, all of these great resources that are, digital and printable publications, I would also say that a huge resource that PWSA offers is our professional providers conference at our conventions. And then, as Stacy mentioned, just last year, we held our first standalone residential providers conference. And I wanted to pick both of your brains as to why coming together is so important for this community and what kind of impact you see that this has on professional caregivers.
To me, it's a symbiotic relationship, right? We have something that we are passionate about, that we are experienced in, and we want to teach other people, right? And then you have the other side of people who are learning, right? And they're passionate about what they do, and so that they can sort of learn more. I think having those sort of natural sort of conversations around those things without individuals and their families being there and having some frank and open discussions. I think providers want to and need to sort of have that. And so I think it's really, really important for people to come together to sort of be able to help troubleshoot, because there are some very unique challenges that come up with individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome. There's a very famous joke I told at one of our professional provider board things that I can't mention here on air. But again, it was a very unique experience to individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome, and and people were looking for answers. So I think that's the big thing: is what do you do? What are other people doing that I can learn from, that I can take back and make the life for somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome better and more fulfilling. I think those things are really, really important, and that's hard to recreate in a webinar. It's hard that's not something you can write about in a book or a blog or something like that. You only get that through those personal interactions. And it's not the conversations that happen inside those conference rooms. It's the conversations that happen in the hallway, that maybe happen at the hotel bar while you're having a soda. All those things over dinner, on the bus ride back to the airport, doesn't really matter, but those organic conversations and those real conversations are really, really important to increase your base of knowledge and experiences when it comes to working with people with Prader-Willi syndrome. They're absolutely invaluable.
I completely agree. I think one of the things that's unique to the professional provider conferences in PWS is there's people who've been coming to them since the very first one, and they still walk away having learned something. It's a space where, regardless of how long you've been doing it, nobody walks in thinking that they know everything. And everybody comes to the table wanting to learn more from each other. And I don't know that I've seen that in other spaces.
Yep. And I also think the group has opened up. When we first started, we were a little closed. We sort of had a very tight knit group and we all knew each other. And so it was sort of a bit of a challenge sometimes for new people to come in and break through that wall. And there were a number of people that were sort of able to do that, right? And again, we're getting together, we're having conversations, they're telling stories, we're telling stories, and you build those relationships, right? And so I think the group is much more welcoming than it used to be. And there's a lot of reasons why it was the way that it was, and I think some of those barriers have been broken down. There have been sort of changes and things like that, and so we're at a point now where it's sort of we're very welcoming, and in that way we can have conferences that have a broad range of people and experiences to learn from.
Yeah, very well said by both of you. And I know that we had people even just coming to our residential providers conference last summer that were from different states that we hadn't, necessarily worked with before. Wasn't Alaska?
Yes.
Someone came from Alaska? That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. It was really, really great. And that was somebody who was supporting one person and
Mhm.
didn't know where else to find the information.
Yep.
So, sometimes I think we also forget just how valuable of a resource it is to those people who are just starting.
Mhm.
And there is nowhere else for them to turn. So we've got to keep being open and inviting people to the space.
Absolutely.
And if we're not vulnerable about the challenges, they're not going to be either. So I think that's one of the areas that we've all on the provider advisory board have grown tremendously, is being willing to share the mistakes that we've made over the years.
Right? Because we've all done goofy things and paid the price. And if we can pass that on to other people to not make those mistakes and, to work with them. I mean, one of my favorite things was going into, somebody was going to open up a Prader-Willi syndrome specific home in New York State, and I would go and do sort of a pre-walkthrough with them, right? And it's like, all right, well, you want to get rid of this lemon scented soap, sort of all the things that you don't sort of think about, right? And that we've had experiences with, and challenges with, all right? And being able to set them up for a greater chance of success is extremely rewarding.
Down to the nitty-gritty details. I love it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the stuff that you don't think about until you've been
Yeah,
burned by it.
right.
Mhm.
You say don't sweat the small stuff, and everything's small stuff. So
Exactly.
Always sweating.
so making sure that people are set up to be successful, right? And because because you're building trust with the individual, you're building trust with your staff, you're building trust with their family, and if you make an elementary mistake, it can be costly in garnering that trust.
So true. Well, before I ask my last question, is there any other topics or anything else you want to discuss as far as the advisory board?
I think it's a wonderful resource available. As serving on the board, I have the luxury of meeting with a lot of parents and being able to talk to them about their hopes and dreams for their child and what they sort of hope they'll be able to gain out of living in a group home. Helping people being able to leverage technology and serving people with Prader-Willi syndrome is very, very exciting. Making sure that they know about those resources, know that they're available to them. I think that's really, really important. Talking to them about the importance of communication and things like that. So I think the board is really a tremendous resource to the organization. That, is able to support people and their families through the continuum of life.
I would share that I think that the board is doing a lot of work, but there's more work to be done that we're going to be seeing out of this group. So, we're pivoting a little bit in how we're reaching out. So, the group is hosting now monthly open Zoom sessions for providers, behavior analysts, direct support staff, their administration, anybody who wants to jump in and just talk, ask a question, or run a scenario by the group and really have those between conference opportunities to build those relationships and ask those questions so that the relationships can be built faster and more seamlessly than waiting every other year for a conference to get together. So I'm really excited at the commitment of time that we're seeing from this group. Providers are incredibly busy. So for their willingness to carve out time to continually do this, I think that's admirable.
I'll tell you a funny story about the manual, the book that we put together. So my son did an internship at Latham Centers this summer, and he was in one of the group homes, and he stumbled upon that book and was sort of amazed to learn that I was an author, right, a published author, as he said, right. We hadn't told him that. And I said, well, Grant, I go, the reason that we didn't really talk about it much was because I had gone over to the conference, I missed your preschool graduation. It wasn't something that your mother and I were willing to discuss with you, right? And so, I think too, I think people take some of the sacrifices that providers make in for granted. And again, if you go to a conference that's 2 or 3 days that you're away from your family or away from your job doesn't stop when you go to a conference. You're taking phone calls. You may have to after the conference go back and answer emails and return phone calls. So there's a lot that group does that goes unrecognized, and I think there are a lot of people that see that, and there are a lot of people who don't. And I think we should be able to recognize those sacrifices that our providers make. It's not an easy job.
No.
It's not.
And that's so well said. And that actually answers my last question. So beat me to the punch. But Stacy, I'll ask you if you want to add anything to it. And I want to make sure everyone knows listening that this episode is airing the week of National Caregivers Day. It's Friday, February 21st. So I wanted to see if there was a message that you have for, the dedicated caregivers who support our individuals every day.
Sure. As Jeff said, it is a really hard job that often goes unrecognized. I will say, I love my current job, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But working in direct care and working directly with people with PWS, hands down, was the most rewarding job I've ever had in my life. So I want providers to know that as an organization, we see you, we respect you, we value you, and we want to be able to support you and build relationships and help you stay doing the best job in the world.
And direct support professionals are often they are the gateway for individuals and their families. They are the face of our organization. They are the ones that are on the front line and are dealing with things on a daily basis that many of us could not fathom. And so it's really, really important for that group to know that they are appreciated. We do everything in our power as a board to recognize direct support professionals, to make sure that you are supported. Part of what we do is educating the organizations that you work for so that they can better support you and the individuals that you support. That's really, really important. We talk a lot about what are some of the stressors that individuals working with individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome, with their staff, have to go through. How it's different than working with somebody who maybe has autism or cerebral palsy or another developmental disability. It's different. There's a lot of things that are the same, but there are a lot of things that are different. And so I want that group to know how important they are. They are the most important cog in the wheel of the support system. And they often are underlooked. We know that they're underpaid and they're often underrespected, but they are the linchpin of what we do, the cornerstone of what they do. They should be proud of the work that they do, and our society should be proud of the work that they do. Because as a board, we are.
Very beautifully said, and a lot of great points there, Jeff. Thank you. And to Stacy, that, made me emotional. So very, very great way to end here. Thank you both so much for coming on and talking through this incredibly important topic. I think we could talk for, hours on the subject, but we will end it here for today. And we'll have some links in our show notes that address some of the things mentioned, in our episode here today. But again, just thank you to both of you for all the work that you've done on the advisory board and in, your previous life working at Catholic Charities and helping those with PWS. So kudos to you and everything that you've done for the community.
Well, thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
Appreciate you even recognizing that there was a day. I didn't know that there was a paid caregivers day. I immediately think National Direct Support Professional Week in September.
Yeah.
So I love that you even recognized that it was an opportunity for us to share. So thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
Absolutely.
Good work.
Thank you to Stacy and Jeff for joining us on today's episode. Hearing about the dedication and impact of these professionals and the advisory board really shows the hard work that's been done to ensure better care for individuals with PWS. And as we mark National Caregivers Day this week, again, that's Friday, February 21st, we again just want to extend our deepest gratitude to all the caregivers, residential providers, and professionals who dedicate their time and energy to supporting our loved ones. Your work truly changes lives. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this special episode of Pioneers in PWS podcast series. We are so excited to share more episodes for this special series throughout 2025, PWSA USA's 50th anniversary. To learn more about Prader-Willi syndrome and PWSA USA, visit www.pwsausa.org. Be sure to subscribe to the PWS United podcast so you never miss an episode. We'll be back next Tuesday with a new episode, and until then, have a great week.